Hello and welcome to the Children England Legacy Podcasts, a series designed to learn from the 8 decades of work done by Children England and from the decision to close it. My name's Andrew Purkis and I'm very glad to be hosting this podcast series.
And my name's Cathy Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of Children England and have been for the last decade.
In this episode, we're going to discuss the ChildFair state, what impact it's had, what challenges it faced, and how it was led by young leaders.
And for this episode, we are joined by Deborah Tetteh, one of the 26 young leaders, and Chloë Darlington, who project managed the whole inquiry while she was with us for 8 years.
So probably the first thing is perhaps for Chloë, with Deborah's help, to explain to a wider audience what the big idea was and what the ChildFair State Inquiry was.
We at Children England had recognised that the welfare state was pretty threadbare, not delivering the best for children, and had actually been designed in the 40s along lines that didn't really see children as children with their specific needs and requirements. So we knew we wanted to create a refreshed vision of the welfare state, but we also knew that we wanted to give children and young people the chance to lead the design of that vision. So whilst Children England and Cathy and I did the initial research and the fundraising and got some various other organisations around the sector interested in what we were going to do, as soon as we had the funding for it, we recruited a group of young leaders to take it from there and to do their own research. Deborah, do you want to talk about the first couple of meetings and what the sort of young people wanted to do with the project?
Yep, so the first meeting brought together a group of young people, as you said, from across the UK, and we all met up in London for the first time. And I think as activity that really stood out to me was we looked at the different policies, we looked at sort of the political landscape and thought, what would we want to bin from this so that we could start from a fresh point? And I think that felt like a very empowering activity because for me, it felt like young people were not really included in these kind of conversations. They weren't really given the chance to voice their opinion on what they thought about what was currently going on within the government that was directly affecting their lives. So I think from the beginning, it really allowed us to look at what was important to us. And then from there, we went into thinking about our research and what questions we would want to ask and how we could make that accessible to young people. We had feedback from the sounding board, and they sort of helped us learn how to conduct research, make up research questions, but it felt that it was a very collaborative process. And they really just helped us lead the beginning of the project.
So I can say something about the sounding board, if that doesn't necessarily make sense to you, Andrew. The sounding board was a group of experts from lots of different sectors related to the welfare state that Children England was in touch with, who in a traditional inquiry might have been the sort of commissioners with the top-down approach to deciding what the research would do and who to consult and what the recommendations would be. But we turned that on its head because we wanted young people to be in the lead. So we recruited what we thought were the brightest and the best of people from social work and law and children's wellbeing and school and health systems, and asked them to just be a sounding board for the young leaders, to provide expertise when called upon, but not to make the decisions, to support young people to make their own decisions. So, as Deborah was saying, they were a sounding board for the research phase.
Was it clear from the start that this was about the whole welfare state as it affects children, rather than children's services in particular? Was that an important aspect of the thing? So it included education, schools, housing, perhaps, all sorts of things like that?
So I think even from the beginning, before we started the project during recruitment, at least in my interview, a key question was, what is your experience of the welfare state? And what do you understand about the welfare state? So it definitely felt that we were bringing our voice to the system and not necessarily only focusing on parts of the system that focus on children. And I think a very key memory I have of the first session is looking at the tree and it sort of set out different parts of the welfare state. So that included education, but also neighbourhoods and housing, education and healthcare. And I think all of us really had strong experiences from each of the parts of the welfare state. So I think we really came from it as we wanted to revolutionise the whole system and not just focus on children.
I wonder even if you'd like to just talk us through this tree, because you know what the tree is, but some of our listeners may not exactly. Do you want to do that between you?
Absolutely. So Kathy and I sketched out the tree before we met the young people with the main branches of the welfare state. We kept it in an organic form because there are other branches which the young leaders were welcome to talk about as well. But we started off with housing, social security, the NHS and schools, and we created a fifth branch called neighbourhoods so that the young people had an opportunity to think locally about the environment, streets, local democracy, local decision making and things like that. And then we introduced these to the young leaders to see what they thought. And I think the response was pretty positive from the group.
I think it was a really clear way of understanding the whole system, especially visually. And we were really able to identify, especially with the trunk and the different values, and how we could use that to sort of unpick the current state of each of the sections.
I should add, I can see that the trunk has some quite important words. Can you explain how they work? The trunk.
We've got 5 values in the trunk, which are home, safety, love, health, and purpose. And those are our sort of approximation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we believe are the sort of basic underpinnings of a good welfare system for children and for all human beings. They're sort of approximated to make them accessible and inclusive to anybody who might interact with this vision of the welfare state. And the young leaders got to sort of think about how these might be a good basis for the welfare state at the beginning of the project.
And I think it was also something that was really important to carry all the way through, even from the research to then the policy asks.
So the values that are there on that tree, they were originally put there by Kathy and Chloë, because somebody called Maslow had invented
Shall I talk a little bit
tree.
about that?
Yes, but do in just a moment. But the question I was going to ask was, did the young leaders sort of take ownership of those values, even though somebody else had dreamt them up in the first place?
I think throughout the whole project, it was really asking us what we felt and whether we wanted to keep certain elements or remove them. So I would assume, but I can't speak for everyone, that we really did sort of take ownership of the tree, and it did feel like something that we wanted to make sure was on the forefront of our vision.
Do you want to just explain a bit about Maslow's hierarchy?
Yeah, Abraham Maslow is a very influential 20th century psychologist, but who was profoundly informed by the Blackfoot Native American people. So he overtly explained that his time spent with them, he'd learnt this concept from them of there being universal needs for every human being that are met in the community of people. So that some of them are foundational and are essential if you're to then be free and safe to progress, or to pursue ambition, or to change, or to do things for others. So in there are many different ways of understanding it. Some call it a hierarchy, but actually some of the most beautiful representations are a Venn diagram of these interacting levels of need. So at the bottom, it's the really basic stuff. You need shelter and you need nutrition, and you need air to breathe. So if you haven't got clean air and it's suffocating you, that's a basic level human need. If you haven't got food and you're starving, you don't get to learn at school because you can't concentrate because you're hungry. So it's a reminder of stuff that you can overlook and forget about the human condition. Yeah. That if you see someone whose basic needs are not met, then that is the first and very most human. It's not specialist. And it is, every human can recognise the impact of not having those basic needs met, and how it will affect your mind and how it will affect your well-being, and that all human beings can do that for each other. The Maslow is a Western psychological reminder of this basic human nature, the truth about human beings and what we all need. It was very influential in child development since the creation of the welfare state during the 50s and 60s, and influential in then understanding universal human rights and children's rights. That if you have a universal human nature and a human need, then you need the right to those things. So we felt that that was the right reminder of human nature and what all children need, through which to then think about the welfare state and whether it was doing that properly.
Right, so that the young leaders that were running this project took on board that the foundation of all these different branches, like the NHS, housing, schools and so on, should be an understanding of the fundamental importance of home, safety, love, health and purpose for every human being.
Absolutely.
Good.
And including the human beings who do the public service delivery.
Indeed.
So it was really powerful throughout our dialogue and the young leaders' research and work, how very clearly children and young people see the human beings who are teaching them or acting as nurses in hospitals, or that they see that as a human endeavour, not a big institution, but they were really caring about the life and well-being and conditions and stress on public sector professionals. So it is about rehumanising these things that have become very abstract systems and really quite oppressive to their own staff, as well as to people who have been pathologised for needing help.
Absolutely, and I think one lesson I've already clocked from this is the importance of a simple image to convey really important truths. And it was very interesting to me how important that was for Deborah, that actually seeing this tree really successfully shaped the whole exercise. So what happened after that?
So something really key happened after that. The nation went into lockdown. So then we had to grapple with moving everything online, didn't we? We'd had a couple of meetings. Luckily, I think we'd all got together in person and met each other and bonded and created this shared idea of what the welfare state is at the moment. But we hadn't really got going with the research into what young people want from a future welfare state. So then it went online. Can you remember the first stages of that bit?
Yeah, I think at the time, COVID was on the forefront of everyone's mind, but it also felt like a very special time to be doing this research, as the issues that had sort of built up over the decades really showed during the pandemic. So all of our workshops had to move online and really had to adapt to that, because initially we hadn't really thought about using an online format, but actually it helped with being able to get a wide representation of people. And it also really tested the research skills that we had trained beforehand. Take
us through the story then as to what happened, then we'll go back and analyse bits of it afterwards.
So as Deborah said, the young leaders had designed research to conduct amongst their peers to find out their experiences of current welfare systems and what they might want to change about those systems, with the support of Children England, Leaders Unlocked, our youth facilitation experts, and the Sounding Board. They moved that research online and started conducting it. We had a couple of iterations of that when the young leaders said, we've done some research, we've spoken to some of our peers around the country, but we feel like we haven't reached all the groups of young people we want to reach. We want more representation from young people in migrant families who might have moved here more recently, young people, young asylum seekers, young people from certain demographics. So then there was another round of research, also online, to try and build up a representative set of views of young people's experience of the welfare state. And then we had a series of meetings, again online, where the young leaders analysed their findings, which Leaders Unlocked expertly facilitated. over the summer of 2020. Do you want to say anything about the analysis stage?
Yeah, I think we found that young people actually, during the interviews, maybe I'll go back a bit, is that they really, they really enjoyed being able to have their voice heard, especially from a peer who could almost empathize or understand their current experiences, and were really able to get really personal and authentic stories from people. So when it came to the analysis, we found that all aspects that we had initially wanted to delve into, there was actually really great insights. I think also another key thing, as Kathy mentioned earlier, is that young people were able to realize that the reason that they maybe don't engage as much in the welfare state is because they feel like they may be a burden on the current workers. And I think that was very much exemplified during COVID, and how difficult it was for key workers to have to carry on giving essential services. So during the analysis, we were able to sort of break down the key themes, but we also had a section of ideas for the future. And it was actually really inspiring to see how young people saw the current state but could see a brighter future, and that wouldn't be too far away and that could be achievable. So we had the sections of education, healthcare, communities, housing and benefits, but then also those brighter visions at the end of each section.
Can I just add something that it's easy now that we lived through it and it was really long, but in those moments when COVID and the impact that it was about to have were unfolding, we had literally just come from meeting young people together, and they were about to embark on physical presentations. We'd been getting them to practice their presentation skills and their interviewing skills in person. And then all of us, the whole nation, including every young leader and their families and their friends, and all of us as a staff team, went into lockdown and started having to work out what happens to our day jobs and our plans. And so while we were able to do this work with really generous support from several funders, we had made commitments to do it, and it had plans in place and costs incurred. We were really clear that this what's happening to the country and what's happening to everyone in it. We can't plough ahead as if it's anyone's job to do this research. We need to give the space for all of those young people and their families to say, look, we've got too much on. This is just, homeschooling, family, working out what's going on, working out how I'm going to get my A levels this year when I'm not going to school. This is big stuff. And the last thing you need is our programme to be bearing on your mind as a thing that you can't do. So we did openly say, we can suspend this until, we don't know how long this is going to be, but this is not the priority. And we could suspend it, and you get on with priorities in your own life, adjusting to this situation. And all of the young people came back and said, no, this is more important now, because we can do this. We can do this online. We can adapt, but we'll really need it when we get out the other side of this lockdown.
I'm interested in the process of research, where you say that it was supported, of course, by various experts, and they were the sounding board. It was Leaders Unlocked. Were they also experts?
So Leaders Unlocked are experts in supporting young people to do their own peer research and influencing.
I see.
So they work with lots of different organisations and local authorities around the country without a sort of agenda of their own to facilitate young people's empowerment.
Good.
So they're not subject experts in the way that the sounding board were. The sounding board might know about education or health. Leaders Unlocked would say, we don't need to know about the content because we're here just to train up the young people to do what they want to do.
So Deborah, I'm interested. I mean, you probably would not have thought of yourself as an expert researcher when you were looking at different aspects of the welfare state. So what did it feel like when you were trying to be responsible for the research with the help of sort of people who were in a way more expert than you and so forth? Did it actually feel that it was yours rather than, you were being led by the experts?
So I would also say that this project was the first I had done with Leaders Unlocked, who, as Chloe said, they specialise in sort of youth-led empowerment through research and policy. So it was a very novel experience for me. But I think from the beginning, it was like literally reiterated that this was going to be led by us, that this project is for us, and that the experts in a way are there to support us, but that we were experts by experience, and that our experience and our thoughts were just as valid. So I would say that throughout the experience, we were allowed to ask questions where we weren't too sure, and it definitely felt like it was a safe space to learn and to grow and to understand what was important to us throughout research. I think research does feel like a sector which is not as accessible for young people, but actually we conduct research on a daily basis. We ask questions to Google, we are often doing experiments, so actually breaking it down to the principles of research, such as asking a question, what are our goals, what do we want young people to feel like when we're giving these questions, it really enabled us to find ways of asking which also felt accessible to the participants.
Had you ever had the experience before in your life of people asking you for your opinion and your lived experience?
No.
So it's quite something.
That's definitely what made the project very special.
So we've got as far as meeting up online to analyse the findings of the research. And as Deborah said, we'd broken it down into the themes of the branches of the welfare state. But we'd also got some cross-cutting themes. One of the things that the young leaders said very quickly was that we need to remember everything's interdependent. We cannot keep siloing off these different systems and saying education isn't related to health, health isn't related to housing, etc. Young people's experiences are completely integrated. And I think all of you in your different ways were really clear that we have to keep these things joined. So although the welfare state is a huge subject and we had to break it down somehow, the young leaders were very directive about us keeping the connections between the different branches. So we sort of moved from analysis that looked at each branch in turn into conversations that brought the different branches together so that the young leaders could start to see how is housing affecting young people's health, how could education contribute to the neighbourhood, and those sort of cross-cutting ideas. So I think that the analysis sort of evolved, didn't it, until we got to a big weekend of meetings with the sounding board where we started to imagine the welfare state in 2030, which now seems quite close. At the time it felt a bit further off. Do you remember the summit with the sounding board? Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, so that happened over 2 weekends. And I think from the data, the young people who we conducted research with already had quite practical ways of thinking about the welfare state and how we could improve it. So we definitely had a lot of good material to then think about, okay, how are we going to separate these into things that we can call to the government or call to the sectors to try and implement into the work.
Leaders Unlocked facilitated this big 2-weekend summit of the young leaders and the sounding board. And as Deborah said, there were lots of practical ideas from the young people who participated in the research about how things could improve. Leaders Unlocked had a particularly sort of creative and imaginative way of getting the young people and the adults in the sounding board to imagine what the welfare state would look like if it was enabling all those practical ideas. We used sort of character-based scenarios to imagine what about a young person living in the north who has to move away from home to find education and wants to work in this sector but can't find a job or doesn't have the training. So we really got to sort of walk through the lives of young people in 2030 and imagine what do systems need to be doing to enable them to live the lives that they want, which was a great way of bringing together all the different branches and silos to remember young people are holistic beings and the system needs to not compartmentalise them. So by the end of the summit, I think we had some quite clear ideas of parts of the system and how they might look. So we had an idea of housing that one young person came up with called Jigsawville, which was a new sort of social housing development with lots of different amenities. I won't go into massive detail about all of them. We had an idea for community health hubs, which was a sort of local by default hub in every community where young people and older people can go and really sort of take agency in their own health. So we had these really quite specific visions for new parts of the system, or ways of bringing together existing parts of the system, which were quite motivating, weren't they? Quite hopeful.
And one of the, I mean, they were really diverse as well. So some of them were very focused on changing the training or the philosophy for the professionals. So there was really practical, deliverable things, like, but would be quite systemic changes if you achieve them. So for example, for all health staff in the NHS to be trained in listening, but rather than diagnosing, so they were emblematic things. But the other thing that came through the summit weekend, I've got pictures of Jigsawville, and there were some Power Rangers or Avengers or something at some point for disability rights. But there were also some principles and values, because what they very wisely also acknowledged was that they didn't and never did want to be setting what they thought in stone and then saying, do what we said. So all the time, all the young leaders kept saying, yeah, but we can't be the ones to have the final say on whether this is right or not, because this hasn't yet involved the dialogue that needs to happen in the community where it happens, or for the young people who are receiving it. So what we need are some principles that carry on in dialogue. Where you want to make a child-fair state, you start with continuing the dialogue and using these principles, because it's not a blueprint. It's a philosophy for reform.
So it's not a blueprint, but nevertheless, it got pulled together in some form, accessible form for interested people. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so we've put it all in a book, which should enable people to understand what we did in the ChildFair State Inquiry, and then take it and run with it with young people in their own community or at national level. And it is, as Cathy says, there were values and approaches that came out of those young leader and sounding board discussions, which are threaded through the book, so that you can see those sort of starting principles when you start your own childfare work. There are policy recommendations in there, plenty for central government, and plenty for local authorities, and plenty for individual sectors, which can also literally be put into a manifesto should anybody have the appetite for it. But what's also important in the book is that we talk about the process. And so you've been asking us about the process. It's really important that people understand how we did it, not because people have to do it in exactly the same way, but because it does have to be reiterated in each area. We don't want adults to go in and say, well, here's what one group of young people said they wanted, so we're going to give you, a different group of young people, these things. One of the recommendations about schools, for example, is that young people are much more involved in decision making in schools. Not that young people in one area write a set of policies for young people in another area, but it has to be from the ground up. So that's talked about in the book, with that principle threaded through, that children and young people should be involved in making those designs, and also at central government level.
And just to be prosaic, if anybody actually wants to get hold of this book, how do they do that?
Good question. Over to Cathy.
Well, currently, and beyond our closing, the Children England website is still up. It has a PDF accessible version of this book that you can view for free online. It also, on the same page, so ChildFair State Inquiry on childrenengland.org.uk, there is a hub there where you'll be able to see also a recording of the launch, where many of Deborah's colleagues in the inquiry also spoke about their role and their feelings and their sort of priorities and hopes. There is a form in that page at which you can ask to be sent a print copy. We still have some, And once we're closed, our friends at Quorum will have the stock of those until it runs out. But they are available. And, you know, in the event that anyone is looking at it and thinking, I need one of those for all of my staff, we will be happy to share it for the purpose of mass print runs if you can pay for those.
Okay. And just before we go back to look at, you know, some of the blessings and challenges of the whole method and so forth, I'd just like to know, how is it being received? What, so far as you can judge, what kind of impact might it be having in different areas? How optimistic are you that you know, this tree is going to grow and prosper?
Well, I'm sure Cathy will have some things to say on this, but from my experience in the past couple of years, we started sharing the findings and the recommendations and the principles of the ChildFair state with various different audiences in those different branches of the welfare state. And the immediate reaction from professionals in those branches was hugely positive. I mean, you know, without any question or shadow of a doubt, really, really positive. Either because they felt that it was needed already, and this really reaffirmed their sense that it was needed and what they were hearing from young people, or that it was brand new and this was really inspiring for them. The sounding board themselves were drawn from these different branches, and they are huge champions of it, and have been very positive about the recommendations. So we know that where we and the young leaders have spoken to professionals, it's landed on really sort of fertile ground, I think. As Cathy said, we had a launch event for it, and the children and youth sector were hugely positive about that. Anybody who meets a young leader and talks to them about their experience of it gets very worked up about the need for the welfare state to become more childfare. But that's on a very sort of small sort of person-to-person basis. As for the wider impact of it, obviously with Children England closing, there's a finite amount of work that Children England ourselves have been able to do. We have sent the ChildFair state vision in this book form to key politicians in the major parties, leaders in the sector.
I managed to put one in Keir Starmer's hand at a speech that he gave about education, but we don't know whether he's read it.
Have you been involved in any of that, Deborah, the sort of spreading the word in different audiences? What have been some of your experiences?
Yeah, so I would say once we finished the research initially, as Chloë said, we started speaking with different people. So we spoke with NHS London, we spoke with Save the Children. And I think one thing that really stood out to me is that there were people who also wanted to champion these views. As Chloë said, it's more on a smaller scale, but this work is happening. So part of our thinking when going into policy was thinking about how can we make this a bigger movement? How can we make this happen on a national level? And during our development of the policies, we looked at other charities and other organisations who were doing similar things to try and understand where the ChildFair state would fit in to support that work or to evidence that work. So I would also say that we've had really good and positive reactions to the work and how important it is. And I think one thing that's also very important to the young leaders was how it would go forward and the legacy almost, because we felt that there needed to be reiterations of the research to be up and to be current with what young people think, as we felt that they have the answers of people bringing the answers to them. We should just go to the young people. So also taking that to a local level, because we also acknowledged how different regions could have very different service provision and how different communities really need to be the ones to lead the change that they want to see.
And do the young leaders still remain in contact with each other? I mean, is there a sense that it might even be a network that will continue to try and find ways of spreading the message?
I think we definitely grew together. We definitely bonded through the experience, and there's people that I still speak to this day from the project. And I think we're all definitely champions of the work that we've done. We've gone off to do different things, but I think throughout whatever we do, we can always bring up the ChildFair Estate as something that could be implemented, or that work that's very important to hear. And I'm sure we have campaigners in the group that would definitely love to focus on the ChildFair Estate and bring that to the public.
I would say all the young leaders have gone on to do things that are related to the welfare state in some way, whether it's further study or work experience or campaigning. Not purely because of their experience with the ChildFair Estate. These were young people who were hugely passionate about the safety net for their fellow citizens, and they will all be sort of championing those sorts of principles, whether they describe it as the ChildFair Estate or not.
But it strikes me that a network of those people would be a terrific resource for any far-sighted charity that might be listening.
Yes. Well, we do want to collect together a self-presenting group of any organisations and people who would like to consider themselves an active champion of the ChildFair Estate. Because, as I said, we can't promise what the work programme would look like around it, but we do have Quorum as the home of the oldest children's charity in the country, willing to still act as a hub for what might come of that and keep the idea alive and the remembrance of it alive. But so if organisations are listening now or have already picked up and read and are inspired by the ChildFair Estate vision, let us know pretty quick. But if not, if we're closed by the time you get hold of us, contact Quorum. But there is an interest in keeping alive, and it doesn't. We mean by that not just people who like the book and would like to say so, but people who are thinking, I would like to be part of making that happen. Exactly,
because sadly, Children England may be closed, but the young leaders are not closed. They're still there, and the sounding board people are still there, and the Leaders Unlocked expertise, that's still there.
And the need is still there.
And the need is still there, and the tree is still there.
That's right.
So, yeah.
I just wanted to add to that question about kind of how people have reacted or
please
the impact, because when we first had the idea, and Chloe and I started talking outside of our usual sector to kind of people who worked in citizens' assemblies or urban planning, or areas that we were genuinely like, just tell us what's happening and does this make any sense? And they said, yeah, it does make sense, do it. But we also had quite a lot of people, policy development can be an area where we think specialism is about knowing tiny bits of the big picture really well. And a lot of people are so consumed with the scale of the idea of reviewing the whole welfare state. Said, I don't even know if I could do that in my area, let alone that much. Isn't this setting young people up to fail? This is too big, surely. And there was a part of that dialogue that happened in the trustee board as well. Yes. Isn't this too ambitious? And isn't it asking too much for young people to try and have an answer to that if none of us did? And we've been working on it for years. And Leaders Unlocked, when we came across them in our discussion, they were the one organisation who said, this is exactly the right scale at which to do it, for young people to have the space to actually have different ideas. So we immediately just said, right, can we work with you? But I think there can be a real fear of big ideas. Yes. In our sector in particular, we tend to shrink it down. What's your evidence? Yes. What's your specialism? Yeah. Don't speak beyond it. And actually, the bigger the idea, the more the space to make sense. And young leaders filled our space that we created with a world of feasible, sensible things, not unachievable at all, and very well evidenced as well. So I would just encourage colleagues in the sector, to think bigger, and it can be better. Because it's very tiring. It's very One of the things that this does so well is it actually gives hope to everyone. Like, well, I've seen the young leaders present to people who are doing their job in the public service every day, and they're ground down by it right now. It's really tough. And then if they're encouraged to think about how bad it is also beyond the NHS, it's also bad in housing, and it's also bad in benefits and social security, and that seems too much. And what young leaders have done is to just say it's perfectly feasible for it to be better. It's not utopian and it's not wild-eyed, and loads of professionals in our public services really need that feeling, which you can get from this, but you get it by knitting it back together, not by breaking it down and apart.
And while we're looking ahead to the future, it is noticeable that in other parts of the voluntary sector, the importance of lived experience is being taken much more seriously and being debated, and the different sort of ways of trying to listen to your users and be informed by them is much more front of mind than it used to be, I think. And as you found yourselves, some charitable funders are very interested in these new approaches. So there are a lot of opportunities there. And the experience of this particular initiative can feed into those sort of wider efforts in quite different subject areas. What are your impressions about how those broader approaches, where's that coming from, and why are they beginning to have traction?
I'm sure that there are lots of views. I just wanted to make one particular point, because I think we really focused on it, and I think we got it right. We did absolutely look for and want to find young people who had the experience and the exposure to how the welfare state works today, because that was the experience that we were looking to inform this work, and in a whole variety of different ways. I mean, most children experience the welfare state because they have some experience of school. So this was not a narrowing or a singling out, but the young people came with a huge breadth of experience. And we found that out, and you were asked in recruitment for sure, but then when they came together, we never asked them to surface or share, or whether it was traumatic or not. It wasn't about being a representative of that bit of the system. You're not here because of that, and you don't have to restrict yourself to that. And so what we got was the wealth of expertise that came, and experience, and then it was applied to everyone and everything, not to trying to stick in that lane. And I think,
are you implying that sometimes it's a trap that we fall into to sort of see, well, we need to have somebody from an ethnic minority to represent ethnic minorities, and we have to have somebody who's disabled? Is that the kind of trap?
I think it's more about how that enthusiasm and that drive to bring voices of lived experience into professional rooms and thinking. I'm afraid that even for the right reasons, for wanting to do that, what it ends up doing is asking them to bring their personal pain and trauma into the room, instead of saying, you are an expert, you're here as an equal. And I think we definitely decided we can't do that. Once you're in the room, this has to be about the whole project, not about fixing what may have gone wrong for you.
You're not a representative of a particular perspective or something. Yeah.
I think we're also moving beyond. I think lots of different organisations are realising that they have to stop focusing on a single issue and work with partners who technically have an expertise in a completely different thing. Housing development companies need to think about the environment. Environmental campaigners need to think about people in poverty who can't necessarily pay for green products or whatever. That's happening on a global scale, and that's good, and it's necessary, and it's essential. And lots of campaigning organisations and research organisations are certainly realising that. Policymakers need to realise it. I don't know whether they're getting it at the same speed that civil society is. But I think what Kathy's talking about with individuals with lived experience is part of that recognition. A young person isn't just somebody living in a particular type of housing that's not good enough. They are a whole person. And the welfare state, it has become very efficient at compartmentalising people. so that you are only somebody with asthma or somebody in a wheelchair or somebody with 3 children on benefits. And no human being and no family, no household is just one issue. We are all holistic people with lots of strengths, lots of vulnerabilities, and children and young people are no different. So organisations need to work with humans, seeing the whole human. A housing organisation like ChildFair needs to work with humans, seeing that they're not just people in a particular type of housing. So there is interdependence between services, between organisations, between campaigners, and there needs to be interdependence between policy making in different government departments, which is horribly siloed. I think Children England is not the first organisation to work that out. I think global issues are forcing us all to confront that. But increasingly organisations are working with individuals, seeing them as the whole person. And that's what we tried to do with the young leaders. And the young leaders absolutely knew that from the start. They saw that the welfare state compartmentalises people and they didn't want it to be perpetuated.
And I definitely think coming to us as wanting people that are passionate about creating change within the welfare state instead of asking us only about our direct experience really helped in terms of collaboration between us, as we were able to either surface those traumatic experiences or not. But even if we didn't lead with that, just having those people in the room of those different experiences really helped us with the breadth and the depth we were able to get with looking at the welfare state as a whole.
And I can't help reflecting that at least in some key areas like social work, the trends have all been unfortunately in the other direction. That there were very inspiring ideas in the 1970s and 1980s about patch social work, where social workers would relate to the whole family and the whole human being and work from there to build community and to build up kind of preventive and protective mechanisms and so on and so forth. But then if you roll forward to today, it's much more emphasis on specialist child protection expertise. And so there's a lot of sort of reversing and rewinding that may need to be done to realise this vision. Now, I'm wondering, we've looked at lots of positive things, but I mean, there must have been some challenges and tensions in trying to do things in such a different way. Do you want to start, Deborah, on any sort of challenges, difficulties, things that were actually awkward, that didn't quite go the way you'd hoped along the way?
I think definitely while we were looking at the visions, one thing that kept coming up was about a lack of funding within the welfare state, and whether even if we had these great ideas, would they be able to become a reality due to this factor? So I think there were a lot of practical challenges that could feel a bit disheartening while we were doing the research, but we really made sure to not circumvent that, but to think if we had important ideas, that the funding aspect would come from that in a way. So although that's a barrier, if the idea is good enough, then hopefully that aspect would be championed in a way.
We were also all very blessed by one of the young leaders having a particular passion for tax policy. So whenever the questions came up of sort of, would that not cost more money than would make us sound sensible, she would regularly just come back to, well, we can make the money move around differently, or we can tax that in order to do that. So, and actually that for me was so refreshing compared with most dialogue about policy in the charity sector. We seem to forget that we can think creatively about what taxation should do to raise and redistribute money. But for her, that was a no-brainer. This is what I mean when you create the space and say, what could we do differently? Everything's on the table.
Yes. What about the challenges of trying to ensure that the leadership of young people and the young leaders was consistent and real? Because it must be almost impossible for those who are used to being experts and being leaders in a more traditional sense to try and sort of forget and unlive their way of living and thinking for years and years and years. Were you conscious that they were struggling sometimes to give you the space really to lead this thinking?
I think I would say that Leaders Unlocked are really good in prepping both sides, so the young people, but also the experts that would come into the workshops, into the dynamics that we would try to create. So I think the young leaders were definitely allowed to do work beforehand to make sure that they had sort of developed the ideas they wanted to bring to that session. And that meant that when the experts heard that, they knew that, okay, this is not somewhere where I'm going to lecture at someone or I'm going to have to speak to them. They're also coming with their own well-developed expertise and they can meet in the middle. So I think the dynamic from the beginning and also from Children England was for the young people to first bring their thoughts and bring their experiences and work off of that.
I agree with Deborah wholeheartedly that Leaders Unlocked were really, really great at setting the dynamic, giving the young people the platform first and the sounding board were carefully chosen by me and Kathy to be people who absolutely believe in the priority of young people's voices. And so that part of the process, I think and I hope worked really well. For me, I thought daily about that balance between empowering people to speak up and share their own ideas, with giving them too much of a blank slate and setting people up to fail. And that's not about age, that's about any of us. If somebody puts you on the spot and says, what do you want to change about the welfare state, you're being set up to fail. So you're not helping young people to lead anything by saying, over to you, here's a tree, do as it with what you want. Leaders Unlocked were great at striking that balance in our own work more directly with the young leaders. It was an absolutely daily challenge. How much support do we provide that's not directive, that's empowering, that gets the young leaders doing what they want to do, but doesn't just, give them a blank piece of paper? And I don't think we got it right all the time. I think I was very wary of accidentally directing where the project went and probably could have given more support. But Leaders Unlocked are the absolute experts in that. And they provided lots of structure within which we and the young leaders could act, but they never influenced the agenda. And I think that was their expertise. We didn't have so much expertise in that, so we had to constantly check. And I don't think we always got it right. One
of the primary areas where it was a challenge that we tried to keep invisible from everyone involved in it was that we did raise funds for it. And that was all pivotal to making it happen. And we raised largely unrestricted core funding from charitable funders who got that it was a mission, not a kind of a fixed term project. However, it's really hard in our culture, in our sector, to say this should happen and it should be led by young people. Therefore, we cannot tell you what the outcome will be or when. We had to say, even in the most reasonable and non-controlling kind of funder dialogue, they want to know, when does it finish, or will we get a book? I mean, young people wanted there to be outputs and achievement and kind of stages and things to come out of it, but we couldn't promise what those would be before we'd gone through that process with young leaders. So it could have been a TV series, it could have been a computer game. We tried to keep all of those things open, but on the other side of it, people who supported and funded it, we had public donations as well, who were saying this is a great idea or I want to see it. And you have that constant sense of, we've persuaded you to set it off, but it's now not ours to account to you for because it's led by young people. So if they want it to go this way, we're committed to following that. And so in organisational kind of cultural governance accountability terms, it was really more, and we were never a seriously up to our eyeballs in KPIs and delivery plans organisation. No. But even to us, it was still a challenge to say, we've embarked on it, now we have to follow.
And of course, it's something that governments would find even more difficult, when they're answering questions about value for money and all the rest of it. So it's something that where the voluntary sector is better placed to give a lead like this, and charitable funders as well, because they don't have to obey various rules about strict accountability and value for money and blah blah blah. So it's encouraging that the will was found within the charity sector to go for it, actually.
And I have to say, one of the most pivotal of those funding support, the funders who got on board with this, is the Blagrave Trust, who we'd never heard of. And as soon as we put out our fundraiser for hoping to do this, they picked it up, they contacted me and said, I think we'd like to fund that. Would that be all right? And they completely understood. It's making the commitment to make it happen that we believe in. We didn't have to write a bid. We didn't have to promise an outcome. They said, we want to be part of that. Is that okay? So I think it's a really good example of the difference in the charity economy. You can express and put money behind a belief that this is the right thing to do. Let's see where it goes. Yes.
And of course, there is one quite strong strain of ideology, even within the charitable sector, that impact is all important, measuring impact is all important. That has to be treated with great care when you're beginning to address the sort of issues that this project addresses. You can't actually start with a log frame or a particular view as to how you're going to identify and measure impact.
In fact, I think one of the main messages from the young leaders throughout the project would be completely undermined if the government said, well, we'll fund some of this work if we get the impact we want. One of the sort of consistent themes was not specific policy changes, but you need to embed young people's voices in policy making in perpetuity. Well, you absolutely shouldn't be predicting what the impact of that will be. You should do it because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely, by definition. And lots of the young leaders have been really passionate about that. You need to trust that you will get the right policies and practices by involving the people affected by them, not just young people, but older people. And if there's a message for decision makers from the ChildFair State vision, it's do that. And then you will get the right answers. Don't necessarily read the book and look at education policy or health policy, but ask young people. It's not about impact.
It struck me too, from what you've been saying, that it would be very easy to misinterpret the message that you could listen to the voices of young people, in the sense that people could say, well, let's easy, invite them in. We'll invite them in and they can tell us what they think, and we'll do our best to take it into account. The sort of exercise that you've been involved in, Deborah, wasn't like that, was it?
Even within those discussions, it's about making those accessible. I think when certain organisations can invite young people in, it is sort of business as usual, speaking in acronyms and jargon that young people don't really find accessible and therefore don't feel like they can be a part of the conversation. I think it's definitely about setting rules where young people can contribute, but that also the experts or the professionals in the room can find a way to relate to them as well. I think it's a two-way system than just inviting young people and they'll bring all the amazing ideas. It's also about creating the environment where collaboration can happen.
I was reminded just the other day that long ago, long before we did this and before I worked at Children England, when I had my first ever training in how to talk on the media, news media training. And we were being trained by a very experienced news presenter to be ready to be put on the spot with a Paxman question or a kind of put your point across. And I remember asking her, who should I imagine I'm speaking to? I know that I'm speaking to the journalist, but the camera is here. So who should I imagine is on the other end of the camera? And she said, imagine you're speaking to a curious bright 14-year-old who doesn't know anything about what you're going to say, but really wants to understand. And she said, if you can get that right, because we all know that state of being, because we've all been it, you know, if you can get that right and explain it to them in a way that they understand both what they need to know and what you're saying, then it will work for everyone. Like, it was a different version of our strapline. We say if society works for children, it will work for everyone. And she was saying if we can communicate and discuss everything that you're about, policy, politics, how things are working, how things are not working, if we can discuss it as if we're all bright, curious 14-year-olds, we'll get there. And it still works for me today. I cannot tell you how many adults have a massive reaction to that tree because they've never had it discussed in their workplace, that simply.
So talking about humility, I think one of the other challenges I found once we were trying to influence decision makers and leaders with the ideas of the ChildFair State Vision was there had been a certain humility about decision making in the pandemic. There was a sense from government, from the civil service and from politicians that they didn't know what was happening because everything was so unprecedented. And civil servants were talking to the charity sector more than they normally did. They were in listening mode, as we would say. There were lots of public inquiries into how public services were faring under all this pressure. And some of the young leaders, including Deborah, spoke to a committee in the House of Lords who were running an inquiry into public services post-pandemic. And the young leaders, as Deborah said, were absolutely clear, this is the time. Young people are hugely aware of how much we need the welfare state now, with the pandemic and afterwards. And the government seems to be listening, now we need to tell them. And so young leaders spoke to that committee, and it was a great discussion. I thought it felt like a real partnership of equals, and there was real humility amongst those lords and ladies that they didn't know what had been happening in the past couple of years for children and young people, and they just needed to listen. And it's all gone. Because apparently that's over and the government doesn't need to be so humble. And of course you need to show leadership, and they need to know what they're doing to some degree. But that was a real challenge, that we had such hope as we were coming out of lockdown that things would be refreshed and renewed. And we've all got our examples of how disappointingly we haven't had that. But those types of conversations I don't think are happening nearly as much as they were, and they should be.
Mm.
And I also think that during the pandemic, there was a sense of, if we did have these approaches in place beforehand, that the policies would reflect people's experiences a lot more, and that we wouldn't be in such a dire experience as well. So as Chloe said, to know that we've stepped away from that, I think that's definitely not the hopes that we had, but it can be achieved. And I also think coming to the ChildFair State and sort of positioning it as a child's vision or young people's vision for the welfare state sort of takes away from the fact that in almost every branch there was an aspect of intergenerational collaboration and involving older people and young people within the same space, and how that could actually have a really big impact.
Well, I think that is a very good note on which to finish this session. Yeah. So we finished this session in a spirit of hope, to which this project has contributed a lot. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.